It is my distinct honor to welcome you to the Prathia Hall Lecture, a biennial series that bears the name of one of Princeton Theological Seminary's most distinguished alums, the Reverend Dr. Prathia Laura Ann Hall. This lecture series commemorates her name and seeks to enshrine her legacy, a legacy forged in the crucible of struggle, shaped by sacred conviction, and consecrated through a life lived in pursuit of justice, mercy, and theological integrity. Prathia Hall earned 3 advanced degrees from the seminary: her Master of Divinity degree in 1982, her Master of Theology in 1984, and her Doctor of Philosophy in 1997. She sat in our classrooms, studied in this library, and prayed in our chapel. But make no mistake, Prathia Hall did not need Princeton Theological Seminary to develop a robust conception of God, nor to discern her call. Her conception of God and sense of self and call came early in the Mount Sharon Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where her father was the founding pastor. And her theological formation continued to be shaped in the red clay of Georgia and the unyielding pavement of the American South during the Civil Rights Movement. As a leader within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Prathia Hall stood on the front lines of the Black freedom struggle. She was jailed, threatened, and surveilled. Jailed, threatened, and surveilled for what she believed and what she refused to deny: the full humanity and dignity of Black people. Her prayerful oratory was so moving and memorable that in 1963, a Baptist preacher from Atlanta stood before the nation and borrowed the repetitious rhythmic line that he heard her pray in Albany: "I have a dream." And yet, Dr. Hall did not rest in the shadows of history. She stepped boldly into her own vocation. Her own vocation as a preacher, a professor, and as a prophetic voice to the world. One of the first African-American women ordained in the American Baptist tradition, she went on to become a pioneering womanist theologian and a gifted professor of social ethics, becoming the first woman to hold the prestigious Martin Luther King Jr. Chair in Social Ethics at Boston University until her death in 2002. The Prathia Hall Lecture is a biennial sacred summons on this campus. She reminds us that theological reflection, when done faithfully, must be wedded to justice and liberation. She compels us to interrogate power, to amplify the voices of the marginalized, and to imagine a world made new by the audacity of God's amazing grace. Therefore, we welcome you to this lecture and this experience tonight. And to introduce tonight's lecturer, I am pleased to present to you Dr. Heath W. Carter, Associate Professor of American Christianity here at the seminary and the director of our PhD studies program. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carter.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you. I'm grateful to President Walton for bringing Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall into this room, her spirit, and what a remarkable opportunity to honor her this evening. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Danielle McGuire, as well as my distinguished colleague, Dr. Carrie Day. First, Dr. McGuire. Dr. McGuire is an award-winning civil rights historian, public speaker, and the author of the marvelous book, which we have copies of outside, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement, from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. Just an aside, I've taught that book. It is a remarkable read, which will, and you'll see why tonight, completely transform the way you think about this powerful movement in our history. Dr. McGuire is also the editor of Freedom Rights, New Perspectives on the Civil Rights Movement, wrote the foreword for John Hersey's Algiers Motel Incident, and has contributed chapters to many other books related to the Black freedom struggle. She is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and has appeared on PBS, CNN, MSNBC, Headline News, National Public Radio, and Book TV. Her popular essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Detroit Free Press, Bridge Magazine, Washington Post, Huffington Post, and CNN.com. She serves as a consultant on documentary films such as The Rape of Ressie Taylor and You Belong to Me, the Ruby McCollum story. She also helps curate historical tours and civil rights-related curricula for secondary schools and serves on the advisory board of History Studio. She's currently at work on a book about police violence in Detroit in 1967, which will be published by Knopf. My remarkable colleague, Dr. Carrie Day, hardly needs an introduction in this space, but I will just lift her up as well at the start here. Carrie Day is the Elmer G. Homeringhausen Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion here at Princeton Theological Seminary. In 2023, she was the first African American woman promoted to full professor in the 215-year history of this institution. Her teaching and research interests are in womanist, feminist theologies, social critical theory, cultural studies, economics, and Afro-Pentecostalism. She has authored 4 academic books: Unfinished Business, Black Women, the Black Church, and the Struggle to Thrive in America, published in 2012. Religious Resistance to Neoliberalism, Womanist and Black Feminist Perspectives, Notes of a Native Daughter, Testifying in Theological Education, and her most recent book, Azusa Reimagined, A Radical Vision of Religious and Democratic Belonging, a remarkable study of the emergence of Pentecostalism. She's been recognized by NBC News as one of 6 Black women at the center of gravity in theological education in America, and she is a 4th-generation preacher in the Church of God in Christ. The order of the program for this evening, Dr. McGuire is going to give a lecture, and then Dr. Day is going to engage her in a little bit of conversation before we open it up for questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Danielle McGuire.
I'm so excited to be delivering a lecture named after the brilliant and fearless Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall, a theologian, scholar, a womanist, and above all, a freedom fighter. Dr. Hall knew the civil rights movement was more than a political struggle. It was a moral and a spiritual reckoning. The people who made the movement were not just activists. They were prophets in the wilderness, calling a nation to repentance. And like the prophets of old, they did so at great personal risk. Dr. Hall understood this better than most. As a field secretary for SNCC, she risked her life organizing in some of the most violent counties in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama. She once said, "I am called to be faithful whether or not I am successful." That call to faithfulness, not outcomes, to truth-telling, not comfort, is the spirit in which I offer this talk tonight. And in honoring her legacy, I want to focus on one of the most well-known civil rights campaigns that is too often, to this day, which I cannot believe, flattened into fable: the 1955 Montgomery Bus Boycott. It is often told, from textbooks all the way to museums and college campuses, as a simplistic tale of an aged woman with tired feet who tiptoed into history. I mean, you all have heard this story, I'm sure. And I know many of you are scholars here and you know the deeper story, but the story you might remember from being a kid or what you learned in school, that Rosa Parks, an old woman of 40, right, just couldn't get out of her seat because she was so tired that she was arrested. And people were so upset that this aged and frail woman was arrested. They all decided to boycott the buses for a year. And the walls of segregation came tumbling down. It's a great story, but it doesn't actually teach us anything about how change really happened. It reduces a year-long community-wide struggle, a political and a social movement, rooted in real issues, to a single person, Rosa Parks, or sometimes Martin Luther King, who acted on emotion and impulse rather than intelligence, a moral conviction, or a long history of activism. This fable presents Rosa Parks as someone without a community, as someone who's not a leader, who's not a member of any organizations, and who did nothing to really organize for change. Even the statues in her honor, which are scattered across the United States, all show her sitting on a bus alone, as if one person can truly change the world by sitting still. So one of the most important movement stories has become really useless history. My work, and what we're going to talk about today, asks us to reconsider this simplistic tale and reframe it as a decades-long campaign led by Black women to defend their bodily integrity and demand sacred recognition of their human dignity. A more useful, more honest history of the bus boycott doesn't even begin in Montgomery, and it's not even really about the buses. I argue that it started on a warm September night in 1944 in Abbeville, Alabama. A Black woman named Reese Taylor was walking home from church when a carload of white men kidnapped her off the street. They drove her into the woods and they gang raped her at gunpoint. They dropped her off in the middle of town and they told her if she told anybody what happened, they would kill her. This was a credible threat in Alabama in 1944. But she somehow found the strength to tell her husband, her father, and the local sheriff the details of this brutal assault. And a few days later, someone from the Montgomery NAACP sent word that they were sending their very best investigator. Her name was Rosa Parks. That's right. It was 11 years before the bus boycott, but she was already one of the most seasoned activists in Alabama. She was the granddaughter of a Black nationalist who took her to see Marcus Garvey when she was just a little toddler. He protected his home and family from the Ku Klux Klan with a shotgun. She cut her teeth, her political teeth, defending the Scottsboro Boys in the 1930s. She worked hand in hand with her husband on voting rights in the 1940s. She served as secretary for the Alabama branch of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the largest Black union in the nation. She was right there by E.D. Nixon's side. He ran the Alabama branch. And of course, she was elected secretary of the Montgomery NAACP all the way back in 1943. But she wasn't a secretary in the way we might think of it today. She didn't file papers or type up notes of meetings or run errands. She was more like a field secretary. Her job was to travel the dusty back roads of Alabama, where she interviewed people and documented acts of brutality. She looked into unsolved murders, into voter intimidation, and other kinds of racial incidents. In the process, she became known throughout the state as someone who could be trusted with delicate or dangerous information. People always said, Rosa will talk to you. Go talk to Rosa. And that's how she ended up on Reese Taylor's front porch in 1944 with a notebook and a pen. She listened to Taylor's testimony before the sheriff chased her out. She wrote it down and she carried it back to Montgomery, where she and the city's most militant activists organized the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor. They helped start a nationwide campaign that the Chicago Defender, the largest Black newspaper in the country, called the strongest movement for equal justice to be seen in a decade. They compared the campaign for Reese Taylor to the Scottsboro movement. Think about that. That's incredible. 11 years later, this group of homegrown activists would become better known as the Montgomery Improvement Association, vaunting its very first president, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to international prominence, and launching a bus boycott that would help to change the world. But when this group first came together to defend Reese Taylor, Dr. King was just in high school. For the next decade, while Dr. King went on to college and grad school back east and seminary, Rosa Parks and her allies in Alabama worked tirelessly on similar cases, mobilizing the Black community around issues of both racial and sexual violence. Rosa Parks said at that time that there were, quote, a lot of white violence against Black people. Things happened, she said, that most people never even heard of. One of those cases was in 1949, and it was pivotal to the bus boycott. It was about a woman named Gertrude Perkins. Now, I first heard this radio program when I was in graduate school. It was about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It was called Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Maybe the library has it on CDs. It was fantastic. It's a series of interviews done with movement activists, and this particular episode, which is about 50 minutes, is about Montgomery. I listened to it, the whole thing again, just the other day. It is so rich. It would be fresh to people now. But I heard this in 1999, okay? And this is what I heard.
Gertrude Perkins is not even mentioned in the history books, but she had as much to do with the bus boycott and its creation as anyone on earth.
Now that stopped me in my tracks because I was in graduate school, so it meant that I knew something. And I didn't know that, so I thought this is very interesting. Let me order up the Montgomery Advertiser since Joe Asbell, the city editor of the paper, was talking. So I ordered it up on microfilm through interlibrary loan, and I found Gertrude Perkins in the newspaper. She was a 25-year-old Black woman who was walking home late one night when two uniformed white Montgomery police officers picked her up, put her in the squad car, drove her to the edge of town, and sexually assaulted her. After the attack, she somehow found her way to her minister's house. That was Reverend Solomon Say Sr., who at the time was a very active minister in Montgomery at the Holt Street Baptist Church. And this is what he remembered from that night.
Two policemen had picked her up and taken her down on the railroad and had all types of sex relations with her at that particular time. And when they put her out, she came to my door and she told me what had happened to her. I sat down and wrote what she said had happened to her, word by word. And when she had finished, I had it notarized and sent it to Drew Pearson in Washington. And Drew Pearson went to the air with it. And when the power structure knew anything here in Montgomery, what Gertrude Perkins said happened to her was all over the nation.
Now, you know he had to take it outside the state to get any kind of traction on this story. He knew he couldn't trust the police. He knew he couldn't trust the mayor. He knew he couldn't trust anyone in the justice institutions in Montgomery. He took it to Drew Pearson, a syndicated columnist who had a radio show, in order to put pressure on officials in Montgomery, and it worked. He tried to take Perkins to the police station, interestingly, to report the crime. They said, well, who was on duty that night? They said, we don't know. No idea. They wouldn't let her see a log of who was on duty. They accused her of lying. They refused to hold a lineup or let her try to identify the officers who were working that evening. The mayor called her a liar and said her charges were completely false. And he said, my policeman wouldn't do a thing like that. But Black folks in Montgomery knew that the police had a history not just of racial violence, but of sexualized racial violence. They knew that they were just as guilty of that as everyone else. E.D. Nixon, who was head of the Montgomery NAACP at the time and branch leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Rosa Parks' neighbor, said in a newspaper article that he had a dossier of 50 cases of rotten violence, one horror tale after another of white male degradation of Black women in Montgomery and Lower Alabama. E.D. Nixon said the assault on Gertrude Perkins was one of the worst crimes ever committed in Montgomery. Since the police refused to take action and they couldn't count on anything or anyone in the system, Black activists organized. A coalition of NAACP members, labor leaders, club women, and ministers formed an umbrella organization called the Citizens Committee for Gertrude Perkins. Their public protests lasted for more than 2 months and made the front pages of the white and Black newspapers in town. In the process, they forced a grand jury hearing, which was a big deal, where Gertrude Perkins testified on her own behalf. They energized community activists who were fed up with the Jim Crow status quo and demanded change, and they hadn't really been working together. Reverend Solomon Say, in fact, was arrested shortly after his activism in this case, and that brought all the ministers into the fold because they had attacked one of their own. So that brought the ministers in with the activists, and that's why I think Joe Asbell said Gertrude Perkins' case was so important. I mean, I still question that. He said she was the most important person in the bus boycott, but it was 1949. Had nothing to do with the buses, but it brought the community together. And it brought them together in defense of Black women's bodily integrity. 2 years later, the exact same activists who organized for Recy Taylor and Gertrude Perkins rallied to defend another victim of racialized sexual violence. In February of 1951, a white grocery store owner named Sam Green assaulted a Black teenager named Flossie Hardman. I found these stories a lot in my research, and I include them in the first part of my book. Flossie Hardman was Sam Green's babysitter for his children. I found babysitter stories too frequently. And he employed her as a babysitter, and he would drop her off at the end of her shift. Well, one night, instead of taking her home, he drove to the quiet end of a dark street, and he assaulted her. Hardman told her parents, and her parents pressed charges. When an all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict after deliberating for about 5 minutes, the family decided they needed more. So they reached out to community activists, the same ones who fought for Recy Taylor and Gertrude Perkins, and they decided to fight back. They knew they couldn't get justice in the courts. So they wondered, where could they get justice? What could they do? I found this article. I thought someone might have thought of setting fire to Sam Green's grocery store was something they could do, because you see the circled section where it says the front porch of the store caught on fire. And I don't know what happened. But what they really decided to do was, since Sam Green had a grocery store that Black consumers mostly bought products from, they would decide to boycott his store. So they rallied the troops, and they told everyone to not shop at Sam Green's grocery store anymore. And within 2 weeks, they put Sam Green out of business. And they sent a message about the power they had as a community. They delivered their own guilty verdict by driving Sam Green into the red. This was a huge victory. And most importantly, it established the boycott as a kind of weapon for justice. 3 years later, in fact, Joanne Robinson, who is the leader of the militant Black women's organization, the Women's Political Council, she threatened to boycott the city's buses after scores of Black women and girls complained of sexual harassment and mistreatment while they were riding. Now, besides employers and police officers, few were as guilty of these crimes against Black women and girls as were the city's bus operators, who bullied and brutalized Black women and girls daily. We often forget this, but bus drivers had police power. They carried blackjacks and guns, and they assaulted and sometimes even killed Black passengers who defied their orders. I looked at the bus company records at the Birmingham Public Library, and they were really revealing about what happened on the buses. In 1953 alone, Black passengers filed more than 30 complaints of abuse and mistreatment on the buses. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but back then, when you filed a complaint like you do today, you need to put your name on that document and your address and your employer's address. And if you did that in 1953, by that evening, you were out of a job. Maybe by that morning, there was a firebomb at your house. Your life would be threatened. This was a big deal to file a complaint. The fact that there were 30, bless you, says a lot to me. Almost all of those complaints came from Black women, working class domestics, who had no choice but to ride the buses to and from their workplace, which was mostly white people's homes. In fact, it was Black women domestics who made up 80% of the Montgomery City Line's ridership. These complaints showed that drivers hurled nasty, sexualized insults at them, touched them inappropriately, and physically abused them. One woman remembered bus drivers sexually harassing her as she waited on the corner. The bus was up high, she said, and the street was down low. They'd drive up and expose themselves while I was just standing there. It scared me to death, she said. Another woman complained that bus drivers treat Black women just as rough as can be, she said, like we're some kind of animal. Another woman said drivers said nasty things and liked to talk under folks' clothes. Many of these women, like Rosa Parks, had already begun their own personal boycotts. I mean, Rosa Parks talks about not ever wanting to ride that certain bus. And when she would see the driver that she didn't like, she would be like, oh, wait. Two things happened that turned these private, personal protests into a mass movement. In the spring of 1955, police arrested, beat, and jailed Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old, for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. People also forget that Claudette Colvin was in the NAACP Youth Council. Rosa Parks was her mentor. Black women in town were furious, and they demanded a boycott right then and there. But local male leaders, even Edie Nixon, weren't sure if Colvin was the right person to rally around. Now, this is a Cold War environment. They're very concerned about respectability and who they put forward as the person. So they waited. A few months later, on December 1st, of course, police arrest Mrs. Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. Now, as secretary of the local NAACP for more than a decade, and best friends with Edie Nixon, who she had worked with on all of his campaigns, she knew that they were looking for the right plaintiff. She was involved in every major civil rights campaign in the state of Alabama. She knew exactly what they needed. So some people think it was planned, but she couldn't have planned what happened that day. Either way, she knew that immediately when that bus driver said, "Give me those seats," that she had to do something. It was rooted in her history as a radical activist. She said there had to be a stopping place, and it seemed to be the place for me to stop being pushed around. I decided, she said, I had to know once and for all what rights I had as a human being and as a citizen. As for any notion that she had tired feet, she said that year, the only tired I was tired of giving in. So her actions that day were less a mystery than a moment. But no one really knew it was the moment, except maybe Joanne Robinson, who, again, head of the Women's Political Council, who seized on news of Rosa Parks' arrest, and she didn't call Edie Nixon to ask permission if they could run a boycott now. She just said, we're doing it. She went to Alabama State with a couple of assistants. She copied on that old machine 52,000 flyers, cut them up, bundled them, and delivered them across Montgomery the next morning. What I find so fascinating about this flyer is how gendered it is. And it's something I think we've overlooked for years. Another Negro woman, she wrote, has been arrested and thrown in jail, right? If we don't do something to stop these arrests, they will continue. The next time it could be you, your mother, or your daughter. So it's a call to action to Black men to protect women and girls in the community, but it's also a reflection of the fact that 80% of the bus riders are Black women and girls. The next morning, an army of Black women delivered these notices to schools and storefronts, beauty parlors, and beer halls, barbershops, and businesses. By mid-afternoon, everyone knew the plan to stay off the buses for one day on December 5th to show the city their power. The boycott wasn't just about where they sat on the bus. Ill treatment on the buses denied Black women a sense of dignity and demonstrated they weren't worthy of respect or appreciation as women. This belief was part of a long-standing pattern that allowed white men and women to use and abuse Black women with impunity from slavery through the better part of the 20th century. It was much easier, not to mention safer, for Black women and girls to stop riding the buses than it was to bring their assailants, like bus drivers, police officers, or employers, to justice. Rosa Parks said many women walked not in support of her, she said, but because I was not the only one who had been mistreated and humiliated. Other women had gone through similarly shameful experiences, she said, most worse than mine. The language is so important here to me. Humiliation, shameful experiences, right? It's not describing where you sit. It's deeper than that. The one-day boycott, of course, as we know, was a huge success. Now community activists had to figure out what to do with all that energy and excitement. A one-day protest was not enough to make change, and a full-scale campaign carried very real risks. None of the established Black leaders in town, none of the ministers, were really, truly eager to take on the white power structure. They figured, because they were rational and had been around for a long time in America, that it would be a short-lived and very dangerous exercise. E.D. Nixon was so upset that he chastised these men in the basement of the Holt Street Baptist Church. He said to the ministers, it was time for them to step off. He said, it's time for you to take off your aprons, using this gendered language again. And he said, these washerwomen have been working their whole lives and have been subjected to so much. It's your turn. It's your time. So they turned to the new guy in town because they were scared, and rightly so. This was a dangerous exercise, and they had a lot to lose, and they knew that they had a lot to lose. So who didn't have as much to lose? The guy who just got here, 26-year-old new minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They asked him to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association and become the spokesperson for the boycott. His decision to accept that challenge, despite his family saying, not a good idea, would fundamentally change his life and, of course, American history. And while Dr. King became the public face of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, it was always Black women like Rosa Parks, Joanne Robinson, and thousands of others who truly made the movement. Their shared experiences of exploitation propelled Black women and girls into every conceivable aspect of the bus boycott. They were the chief strategists and negotiators of the boycott. They ran its day-to-day operation. They helped staff the elaborate carpool system that kept people going from one place to the other. Today we call it Uber, just for the record, right? They started Uber in 1955 and 56. They had a private car system, private taxi system that kept people off the buses and able to move. They raised most of the local money for the movement, I'm sure some of you have heard the story of Georgia Gilmore, a local woman who was a fantastic cook, who made all kinds of lunches and bundled them up and sold them to white folks downtown at lunchtime. And then, they would eagerly pay her like, oh, this is delicious. Thank you so much. And she would say, no, thank you. And then she'd take the money to the movement and she'd come to mass meeting with all of the money from the white folks and, she'd be celebrated. And she did this every week. And other Black women would sell their wares and they would compete, right? Georgia Gilmore was in an organization called the Club from Nowhere, which was protective, right? Because what is this Club from Nowhere? Who's in it? We don't know. It's the Club from Nowhere. But too often she ended up being a footnote in history because of that protection, that kind of secretive activism. They filled the majority of the pews at the mass meetings. And this is really something. If you look at any photograph from the Montgomery Bus Boycott and you pay attention to what you're looking at, what you'll see is almost all Black women in every single photograph, whether they're walking or they're filling the pews at the mass meetings. When you see it, you really see it, and it's remarkable. At these mass meetings is where they testified publicly about these personal encounters that were shameful, taking something that they had bottled up and, carried these burdens on their own, and they passed it off to the community where they shouldered it together and transcended it together and turned that shame into a weapon of protest. Because Black women made up the majority of the riders, they were the ones who had to walk. And they did. Many were arrested, many were harassed, but they kept walking. By walking hundreds of miles for more than a year to protest humiliation, they reclaimed their bodies and demanded the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And finally, after 381 days of walking through the Alabama heat and rain and sleet and all the other things that happen in Alabama, and we forget this too, it was 4 female plaintiffs, Mary Louise Smith, Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, and Claudette Colvin, who filed and won the Supreme Court case, Browder v. Gale, that actually made segregation on public transportation unconstitutional. This is the case that overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. And while it's too often presented as a movement that sprang out of nowhere, like Rosa Parks' Tired Feet or Dr. King's Dream, the bus boycott had a past, rooted in the struggle to protect and defend Black women from racial and sexual violence. It's nearly impossible to truly understand how and why the boycott happened without knowing the stories of Recy Taylor and Gertrude Perkins and Flossie Hardman and Georgia Gilmore and all the other Black women and girls who resisted mistreatment in Montgomery. In fact, without these stories, I think it's impossible to understand why thousands of mostly working class Black women put their bodies and their lives on the line to protest injustice. When we include the experiences and testimonies of Black women, the Montgomery Bus Boycott becomes more than a campaign for civil rights. It becomes a kind of spiritual declaration of Black women and their bodies were not expendable, that their pain mattered, that God was present not only in the churches, but on the buses and in the streets and in the thousands of quiet acts of refusal that ultimately helped to reshape a nation. In closing, when we reduce the story of Rosa Parks' move of the civil rights movement to Rosa Parks' Tired Feet, or this kind of like, I don't even know what this paragraph really says, or we remove the intersectional context of racism, sexism, classism, or violence, like this textbook from Florida does, or as many states are now trying to do through legislation and changes in curriculum, when we do that, history's most powerful and important lessons lose meaning. Ignorance of racism and violence in the past won't save us from the consequences of it in the present. Worse, when we teach the past as a simplistic fable, it's truly impossible to see ourselves as change agents and movement makers. And I hate to wonder if this is the real reason for legislation like this. A more robust, a more honest history, on the other hand, provides plenty of important lessons that we can use to change our present and our shared future. I talked about the bus boycott because everybody knows the story or thinks they do, and it's a great story. And it teaches us 4 really important things that we can carry with us everywhere we go. The first is that it only takes one person to stand up and be brave. Others will be inspired, and they'll follow that example. Soon enough, you have a little committee, a network. Then you might have an organization. Then you have a community. Together, you have a fighting chance. We have a fighting chance. Number 2, the bus boycott was built by ordinary people just like us in this room who did not like what was happening in their community. And so they worked on changing things bit by bit, small things here and there. And over time, they made a massive change, and they did it with the strategy and tactic of nonviolent direct action. They came at things sideways, like Green's grocery store. And they knew that they had to be unreasonably patient. We're so used to getting things right away now. We have to be unreasonably patient in order to see this kind of change over time. They knew change didn't happen overnight. They knew it would take time. That slow, steady work is what civil rights movement activist Ella Baker calls the spade work of organizing. And just like in gardening, seeds need to be nurtured to sprout and to grow. And that takes time, seasons. Number 3, the Montgomery Bus Boycott teaches us something that Dr. Hall learned from Ella Baker, that leadership can be developed, and it can take on many forms and can be found everywhere. There's, of course, the charismatic leadership of Dr. King, but there's also the behind-the-scenes doers and organizers like Joanne Robinson. There's the legal plaintiffs like Claudette Colvin, the lawyers like Fred Gray. There's the longtime community activists like Rosa Parks and Edie Nixon. And there's ordinary folks who just stayed off the buses and decided to walk. There's the church singers whose songs were a balm to activists' hearts and souls. There's the women who sold lunches and used it to fund the movement. There are the volunteer drivers who did the Uber in the 1950s, right? Every single one of these people played a leadership role in the movement for change, and so can you. Finally, the Montgomery Bus Boycott and the civil rights movement as a whole teaches us that hope and faith are powerful things, necessary things. Who among the bus boycotters saw an actual end to systematic white supremacy, endemic throughout the power structure? Rosa Parks feared she would be jailed or killed for standing up to segregation. Her husband lost his job. People's homes were firebombed. Lives were threatened. Dr. King was reluctant to lead the boycott because of these very real risks and the fact that ending segregation at that time seemed virtually impossible. But he, like so many others, hoped it would change. And they had faith that it might. Dr. King agreed to join the movement despite what his rational brain and family and friends told him. He hoped for better, and his faith guided him to fight. Dr. Hall called this freedom faith. As a result of King's freedom faith, he rose to national and international prominence and helped to change the world. He quite literally died for it, as I would argue that Dr. Hall did too. And now there's a giant stone edifice on the Washington Mall in his honor, 40 tons of stone, saying to the nation that we need to hope and fight for better too. As we reflect on the deeper, more useful history of the bus boycott and the civil rights movement as a whole, I think Dr. Prathia Hall's legacy guides us. She understood the past as not a collection of distant memories. It's an active force shaping our lives today, shaping who we are and who we can become. She used the past and the people who powered it to give her hope and direction, and that shaped her freedom faith, which empowers and inspires all of us to fight for freedom and justice today. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor McGuire. It was a really powerful talk, and I remember several years ago when I first read the book. I mean, I didn't know of this history. Most of the people that I talked to actually know that they did not know this history of Rosa Parks, and just more generally of women in the 1930s and 40s, right, that were a part of this very important movement against sexualized violence that would deeply inform and shape the practices of the civil rights movement, what we understand today through SCLC, King, and so forth. But first, I just wanted to affirm and thank you that, through this work, like crucially, 3 things I feel you've done as a historian through this work. I think the first thing is Black women have not been seen as subjects of history, right? They have not been seen as producers of knowledge, as transformers of the ecologies within society. Black women have been treated as, objects and commodities, right? Used in service to the capitalist bottom line, right? Or domestic work, as you talk about, and so forth. So I think that moving Black women back to the center treats them as subjects, but I think also it helps us to understand more deeply our own historical inheritances, right? I think this is what you're trying to press us to do as well, is that there is an inheritance, and part of the richness of that inheritance in the civil rights movement is understanding that it is what it is because of Black women, right? And then secondly, that faith communities have been central. Churches were at the center. Seeing the Church of God in Christ, right, show up prominently here in holiness churches.
That was Reese Taylor's church, by the way.
Right, right. And I'm sorry, I don't want to
assume. Rock Hill Holiness Church, just for the record.
Right. That's right. And just people, background. I'm, sort of within sociological literature and a lot of religious literature. Whether it's holiness churches or Pentecostal churches, have often been seen as sort of, apolitical, otherworldly, not sort of involved in sort of this rich history that we're talking about. And more specifically, that like churches, right, have been, inconsequential to the engine of progress, what we understand as the experiment of American democracy. And I think what you show is that no, actually these women, they were a part of local organizations. Churches were connected, right? And like foundational, exactly, to what was going on. So that also I think is such an important contribution. And finally, and I want to lead to a couple of questions and open it up. I think finally, this sort of argument that sits under your text that, women's bodily autonomy and integrity. There's a way in which these Black women, such as Rosa Parks and others that stood beside her, they understood that crucially as a civil right, as a human right. And I think of like what's going on today, the lessons that this history can teach us of, women's rights on multiple levels, but especially related to bodily autonomy, right, in healthcare and so forth. Sort of the fight that persists that we're waging, and part of your intervention being that to speak adequately about civil rights, about Black freedom struggle in America, is to talk about the way in which sexualized violence was as important, really sort of not just a side to racial justice, but that it was constitutive of the fight for racial. That's right, central too.
Tied together.
That's right, the quest for racial justice.
The very foundation of white supremacy.
That's right.
And then thus,
that's right,
the fight for freedom against it.
Exactly. And so that intersectional, right, like what have Black feminists taught us, what have womanists taught us, is that intersectional analysis, right, of justice, of racial justice, that gender and all these other things play a huge role. So again, thank you. So I had a couple of questions. The first one, this has to do with, I love at the end, you offer ways that we can interact with the history, stand up, cultivate the leadership that you have. and in a kind of moment where certainly a kind of pessimism perhaps may be reasonable. One of the things that, for me, being here at Princeton Theological Seminary and thinking collectively with my colleagues about the relationship between institutions and social movements, what I was struck by in reading your book is that, like, these women, they were absolutely cultivating social movements, but they were also very much so a part of institutions, right? That would, whether it's local organizations.
But not always powerful institutions.
And so talk about that, right? This is
they weren't at Princeton.
They weren't at Princeton,
or Harvard,
right?
Or Columbia.
That's right.
I mean, I don't know why I would raise those institutions' names right now, but right, they were part of community organizations, but they were independent community organizations. So they had some more freedom in those organizations than they had in the organizations that were connected to state governments or federal funding or state funding, right? I mean, that's part of the reason why when Joanne Robinson went to Alabama State to make those photocopies, she was nervous about losing her job because she was using state resources to aid the movement. And that was risky for her, but she did it anyway. But so much of the institutional power comes from independent community organizations, which we often think of as less powerful because they're not connected to the state or moneyed organizations. But they really are the seedbed of activism and change in local places.
That's right.
You know, and they're sheltered in lots of ways because of that. They become safer places because of that. They're not tied in. The same way King wasn't tied in.
That's right.
And the ministers leaned on him.
And so, I mean, is it safe to say that, you know, when we think about, again, going back to some things, the ways that we could be active, you know, in terms of our leadership, that it's not so much thinking in I guess you could say oppositional ways between movements and institutions. Between, you know, do I want to, you know, be a reformer or a revolutionary? But that all of this is part and parcel, right, of how we think about the conditions toward the possibility for social change.
I don't think anyone in Montgomery thought, I want to change the whole system. I mean, maybe they dreamed of that. They wanted that in their bones, perhaps. But that wasn't their intent. Their intent was to make a change locally on an instrument, the buses, that was a site of violence. How do we change this thing that we all have to use every single day? Right, it wasn't about tearing down the walls of everything. It was like, how do I make a change in my community? Because it's not right that I can't get to work without being assaulted. It's very simple. And so I think oftentimes we think we have to go after the big things. We have to tear down the whole edifice, but we really just need to focus on that one brick first, right? And then that one brick can help create destabilization that we can pick away at it. And that's, I think, what the movement did. Bit by bit, year after year. And that was hard.
That's I think a really, really powerful observation about agency, about just not the power of the collective, but the power of the individual, right, within the collective, sort of to make change, right?
And it probably didn't feel like much. I mean, it might not have felt like a revolutionary to just stay off the buses, but every single action that was taken to stay off the buses created a much larger structure that had a lot of power. Especially, you know, financial power, because they shut it down.
That's right. And this sort of leads me to the second question. It comes full circle about women's bodily autonomy, integrity being seen as a right. I mean, so in the history that you gave in the book, you're sort of describing simply the fact, and this is absolutely the case, that this history you're writing about has been virtually erased, right? So we get the what of what is being erased, but I'm curious to hear more from you, perhaps about the why. I mean, first, when I think about the why, I immediately, of course, it seems like the intuitive response is, well, you know, heteropatriarchy, right? That often prevents the telling of these stories concerning, you know, the fact that sexualized violence is absolutely crucial to what would shape in terms of not only you could say the ideology, the anti-racist ideology, but the anti-racist practice that would be involved with these various movements and communities. So that seems intuitive to me. But when I go deeper and I think of getting back to this idea that bodily autonomy and integrity is a human right. It seems like that's fundamentally what is not agreed upon. That seems that that's not intuitive within our society. I think right now in churches, oftentimes it's a very hard conversation to have around rape, around forms of sexualized violence, even within religious communities. Yeah. I think about this within institutions. The Me Too movement grows precisely out of this observation, right, of this problem we have, right, about being able. So I wanted you to sort of reflect, right, that, I mean, certainly it's heteropatriarchy. That seems like right?
But that's not the language they used at the time.
Okay,
talk about so I'm a historian, so I try to look at it the way people talked about it at the time. And so you see, in the 1940s, for example, you see African-American activists and others, using human rights as a kind of slogan. Like, we're fighting for human rights. And that comes out of, I think, both the Great Depression and the World War II moment, right? But by the time you get to the 50s, we're in the Cold War, and that language has been stifled quite a bit. And I think that you've got people being really careful about how they frame their demands. So that's why we get the term civil rights, because they frame it in the context of the Constitution. What does the Constitution offer us, right? Yeah. And the relationship they see between the states and the federal government. The federal government is not enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments. They're not enforcing the Constitution and the civil rights that were guaranteed by the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And so they frame it in a very, I think, safe way that fits within specifically the United States, its history, and the way the United States is being portrayed and portrays itself across the world during the Cold War, particularly to the Soviet Union. So that's part of it. And so even if you're looking at like black newspapers in the 40s, you'll see mention of human rights and demands for human rights, but you don't see that as much in the 1950s, even if that's what people are still fighting for. So some of the language is different. So when the language is different, then the newspapers write a different story. Then historians pick up what the newspapers say, and they tell a different story. So I asked Taylor Branch, for example. He was speaking when I was in graduate school, and I went to see him speak, and I was in the process of writing this dissertation, and I asked him if he had come across assault cases, rape cases in his work on his trilogy on Dr. King in America. And he was like, oh, of course, a lot of them. And I said, well, why didn't you include them in your book? And he said, well, they weren't really related to civil rights.
Interesting.
And I thought that's so interesting that he said that, and I'm so glad that he didn't write about it, because I was like, because to me, it doesn't matter. And I think to Reese Taylor, who told me the same thing essentially, that it didn't matter if you could sit at the lunch counter or that you could vote if you couldn't move through the world without being molested. Like, it was foundational to the very essence of freedom. And I just don't think in the 50s, with the focus on respectability, and you see the politics of respectability play a role, in who becomes the symbol of the bus boycott, Claudette Colvin, Mary Louise Smith, or Rosa Parks, right? It's sort of the same in how they frame and talk about their demands. And what's interesting in my research, I found that, during this time period where there's a silencing of left and liberal activists, and the language from like the 40s and, of human rights, there is also a silencing of rape cases in the black newspapers and elsewhere between, I would say, 1955, 53, and 1959, when Betty Jean Owens' case in Tallahassee, Florida, becomes nationwide news. And by the 60s, the freedom rides and the sit-ins, they kind of overpower these individual cases, but the cases are there. Interesting. But not to the same extent that they were in the 40s. So some of it is about the politics of respectability, the politics of what's possible, the demands the movement is making of the federal government and their state governments, and the way they're framing it for the media, because that was also part of this, right? They were creating campaigns specifically for the media to draw in support from allies in the North and the West. So that's, to me, that's sort of the why. The overarching, of course, is heteropatriarchy.
Right, right.
And there's, and then, you know, Darlene Clark-Heim, Black scholar, would say perhaps it was a culture of dissemblance.
Yeah.
That there is a silence around things that are so painful, and you don't, that Black women in particular don't want to expose and make themselves vulnerable by sharing these really painful things. So what I found in my research, but that there was a tension between testimony, which has a long history in Black history, especially even about sexual violence,
That's right.
and silence. And what I found was that Black women used testimony where there was a possibility for justice, and they used silence when it made sense to protect themselves from the pain or potential consequences. So, you know, it was about the politics of what was possible.
So helpful. So now I want to open it up to the community to ask questions and to continue the conversation. So do we have any? I think I saw a hand. Excellent. We'll take it, please. Did we want a mic? I wasn't sure because we were taped. Okay, excellent.
Thank you very much for your hard work and your research. And I've been to the Rosa Parks Museum, and it's a story that's not told. So thank you for bringing it into the public eye. I hope your book is in the bookstore there. Could you say a word about Septima Clark?
Well, I did not write a lot about Septima Clark, but of course I know about Septima Clark and her work at Highlander and with citizenship schools. And Ella Baker, of course, learned a lot from Septima Clark about finding leadership wherever you are and cultivating people's sense of somebodiness wherever they were, meeting people where they're at, teaching them how to learn the language of citizenship, whether it's reading and writing, literacy, it's assertion of citizenship rights. You know, Septima Clark is so crucial to all the freedom schools that came about in the 1960s, so central to the Highlander School. Rosa Parks was training briefly, but she was there before the bus boycott. I think Septima Clark might have touched every one of the civil rights leaders that, especially women, who came forward and ended up, you know, being pillars in the movement.
Yet most people don't know her.
And yet most people don't know her, Or that, well, never mind, But she's fantastic. And there's a wonderful book about her by Catherine Sharon called, I think, Freedom's Teacher. That is a great biography of Septima Clark.
In your taxonomy of leadership modes, could you compare and contrast the role of the church as an agent of change in the era that you're writing about versus its role in the healing of creation as an agent of change today?
I probably cannot do that because I'm not a theologian. But I do think that...
But I meant sociologically, if you will, as a psychosocial.
But I mean, I really don't think I can even do that because I'm not embedded in the community the way that probably a lot of people here are. I think, you know, as a historian looking back on the movement, and again, I never studied the theology of the movement, but of course, everyone I worked with, everyone I interviewed, they were all part of a church. And the Black women who I spoke with all talked about how they understood their role in the church as doing the work, making the movement, putting pressure on the leadership, but also, like, for example, I talked to Reverend Abernathy's wife at the 55th anniversary of the Montgomery Bus Boycott in Montgomery. And I asked, you know, we were talking about women's role in the bus boycott, and I asked her, I said, what did it mean, you know, women were doing all this work. They were central to the boycotts organization. They were doing it out of the churches, right, for the most part. I said, what did it mean to not be recognized for that work, but to see, for example, your husband and Dr. King and other men, you know, take on that public leadership role? And
her answer surprised me because I thought she would say, well, you know, we didn't really like it, or they were upset, but it was the opposite, quite the opposite, right? She said everybody understood where the center of gravity was in terms of getting the work done in the church, but she said we all love to see our husbands in leadership roles and recognized as leaders of the movement, because they're so often denied that in public spaces, particularly from white people. So to see them step up as leaders, to see them recognized as leaders for the leadership that they provided to the Black community, but to see that recognized in the media was really powerful and highlighted not only their leadership role in the community and the church, but in a much broader way. I know I'm not answering your question, and I totally segued, but I thought of Mrs. Abernathy. So I don't think I can answer your question, but I do think that church is central in the Black community, obviously, to every part of the freedom movement from its origins to today. I hope it's still going on today. I know it's still going on today from the people that I know, but I am not embedded enough to say much more than that.
Other questions? Sure, so we have one up here and then I'll
Thank you. I really liked how you, in the leadership portion, how you weaved in all the different skills, like teaching, like cultivating leadership, and then I liked the singing part, or other skill or passion.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how the person you spoke to said that you thought that the rape cases had nothing to do with, I guess, civil rights. And I was wondering if there's anything else in your research that was like overlooked or often overlooked that you think can play into kind of, I guess, any future insight we may be able to get into kind of how change is done, or how there are different ways in making the steps to massive change.
I think, and I think it's different now, because the literature that's come out in the last 20 years has been very focused on ordinary people making change. And my favorite book about the movement and about ordinary people and the leadership they had in very like simplistic, everyday kind of ways, but showed leadership in those ways is Charles Payne's book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, about the movement in Mississippi. And it's primarily about Freedom Summer, but it's about so much more than that. It's about going into the community, doing the kind of thing that Septima Clark would do, like sit down with people. What is most important to you? What do you need in your life? Let's start there. And maybe you need to, talk to the city about a sewer bill, right? I mean, really simple things that you might not consider part of a movement, but you give people a sense of themselves as agents in their own lives, with power, and some ability to navigate challenging systems or institutions, and all of a sudden they're empowered to do other things. And then you've got someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who had never really thought of herself as a movement activist, but got involved in her community, was always a community leader, right? And a leader in her church, mostly through singing. And she ends up becoming one of the most powerful movement activists in American history. So I think we just need to be broader in our thinking. And if you study the civil rights movement, you'll find all kinds of books that do that take you there, that look at all the different ways the movement happened. I think it's this flattening of our history that has made us think that you had to be some kind of a genius orator speaking in the Washington Monument in order to make a difference in the world. And really, it's just everyday people, deciding not to see themselves as less than and worthy of and deserving of citizenship rights and human rights and freedom rights. And it could be as simple as saying, I'd like to vote today, right? But that took it just extraordinary strength and courage. So I think if you read the literature, and I don't know if there's one book that puts it all in there that way, but maybe that's a good idea for you, right? Like everyday people's guide to movement change, right? All the things you can do, because there is things like that, and I think that would make us feel more empowered, because we think it has to be a certain way, and it doesn't, and it wasn't. That's the thing, it wasn't.
Yeah. And we have time for 2 more questions. Okay, so Professor Laudig, and then we'll.
Thank you so much. This is a beautiful lecture. The question that I had was about age delineations for these activists, and so I was really struck by the image of the Princeton holding the sign that defend Black womanhood, and I'm curious about how and if they deployed the category of Black girlhood, and how they understood girlhood as a particular kind of time and space worth protecting.
I don't know that I ever saw the word girlhood until the last 20 years in academia. I did see the language of protect our women and girls, but mostly protect our women. And I think that picture in particular comes from the Joanne Little campaign in the 1970s. Joanne Little, of course, was a Black woman who was jailed in North Carolina for petty theft. When she was in jail, the white jailer assaulted her, and he came into her jail cell with an ice pick, and she actually managed to get it away from him, and she stabbed him to death and was put on trial for murder. And she was acquitted because it was argued that it was self-defense. That's the last chapter in the book, and that picture is from that. And that comes a little bit later time period, right, in the 70s, when the women's movement is much more part of the public conscience and more active in the streets and stuff. So that language comes up at that time, which is interesting. But I think the language of a protection of womanhood that shows up throughout Black history, I would argue, in particular during anti-lynching campaigns, and then again through the 1930s and 40s. But I didn't see a lot of protect our girls. When I talked to some of the women in my book about their experiences as Black girls, they talked about the language of protection being passed down to them through their mothers and grandmothers and friends, right? Like, you need to be careful in that house. You need to watch out for that person. Here's what we do to protect ourselves. Here's where you could go. Here's where you can call. These were lessons, protective lessons, rather than a sort of public narratives or campaigns, right? So those are the stories they told me about what their mothers and older women in the community taught them about how to protect themselves in vulnerable spaces, which were everywhere. Yeah.
My question, when I read the book, I was a little surprised, and so I'm take this back to a base emotion called shame. And I was a little surprised at when you spoke of Eisenhower and in that era how the U.S. stepped in and sort of wanted to make things right, but it was really to save face. We can't have our men out saying all over the world we're fighting for democracy while right here at home, we in the national news and the international news, we're not protecting our own citizens right here in the land. And that shame seemed to run from the woman, the underreporting of these things because, sometimes as you're told, well, you must be loose, or you must be, you must be carrying yourself in a way that provokes these things. And so you have that shame running from the incident happening up to the international scene. Yeah. And if you speak, excellent on the lecture and everything, but if you could speak a little on that.
Well, I think first about Recy Taylor, because right away, the sheriff knew who did it. She identified the car. He knew exactly who did it. And right away they said, well, she's a prostitute. We paid her, so it was okay. And of course that was not true, but that was the narrative that went up through, the local sheriff to the grand jury, all the way up to the governor. And it was Black activists who countered that narrative of her deserving that kind of violence, of her being the kind of woman that didn't matter enough to protect, and they reclaimed her story from that kind of Jezebel stereotype that was endemic in white supremacy, right? To justify assaults on Black women and girls, and they're the ones who didn't frame it as, in that light. That was white folks who framed it in that light. Black folks framed it as, she's a citizen. She's a human being. She's a mother. They use the language of motherhood. They said she's a wife, right? They couched her in respectability. And more importantly, she deserves access to the democratic system as our boys and men are fighting, not boys, but as our men are fighting abroad overseas. And so her case in particular became a rallying cry for Black soldiers. And then the Black soldiers and others wrote letters to the governor of Alabama and used that language, right? Like, how dare you send us to fight abroad for rights that we can't get at home? And it was her case that motivated them to do that. So I found it interesting throughout this history, the ways in which Black activists used whatever the foreign policy was at the moment, however you could shame the United States, as a wedge to open up political possibilities. So during the war, it was, Hitler, what we're doing is what Hitler's doing. We've got the same kind of Mussolinian tojo in Mississippi. And why should we fight for democracy over there? Well, we can't get it over here. In the Cold War, it becomes about, is America really as great as it says it is? And of course, the Soviet Union countered that narrative as well, right? Like, they would say, well, look at all the terrible things that have happened there. Like, is America really that great? Right. So civil rights activists used that as a wedge to open up the political possibility. And it worked. And so I think today we see, in many ways, people using the deportations, right, as a primary way to say, is this America? Yeah. Is this the shining city on a hill? Is this what we've become, right? Because the rest of the world, I thought of us differently. And so we need to look for those openings as well. Like, when we think of campaigns that could open up possibilities, how can we shame America? Really? Because they might not answer to us individually, but on a world stage where power, it matters, appearance matters too. So they were brilliant at doing that, absolutely brilliant at doing that. Yeah.
And with that being said, can we thank Professor McGuire?
Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Thank you.